Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Investing Sucks. So, in this video, I'm going to be talking about the macroeconomic side of investing, and I'm going to be talking about interest rates and whether interest rates are set to go up or down in the future, specifically looking at Canada. Now, I'm sure this is a video that's going to be of interest to many of you. Perhaps you have a mortgage, or maybe you have investments in companies that are heavily affected by interest rates, whether it be a financial services company, maybe it's a real estate investment trust. There's all kinds of examples out there, and to some degree, pretty much every company is impacted by interest rates. And what I want to do in this video is take you guys behind the scenes to show you what data points the Bank of Canada is looking at right now as part of their coming interest rate decisions, and how you can kind of interpret those economic data points as they get released so you get an idea of what the Bank of Canada might decide to do in the future with regards to interest rates. So I think this video will help you to become more informed about just general economic conditions and how, as those change, what the impact is going to be on your investment portfolio or on your mortgage if that's what you have. And what the Bank of Canada is doing now actually is publishing a summary of the meetings where they decide what to do with interest rates, which is what I have pulled up on the screen here. And they started doing this based on a suggestion they received from the IMF to really just increase the transparency in their decision-making process. So this is the very first time they've done that, which is what I have on screen here. And what they recently announced is that their plan is for the short term to keep rates where they are, which is currently at 4.5%, and really just take a wait and see approach. But they did say that if more hikes are required in the future, then that is what they'll do, and they won't hesitate to do that. And a big reason why they're pausing the rate hikes for now is because of the extremely high debt servicing costs that Canadians are set to face as a result of this. So what we're looking at, this chart here, is the percentage of Canadians' disposable income that's going towards debt service payments, so mortgage payments essentially and other debt service payments. So these are obviously going to increase if interest rates go up because that just increases the debt burden overall. And this is different, as we can see where it currently is at, is around that 14% mark. If we compare that to where the U.S. is, so this is the exact same data we're looking at here, but on the U.S. Side of things. The US is much lower. You can see they're under 10%, whereas us in Canada currently at around 14%. And what is projected here is to go up to close to 17%, which is a pretty substantial jump. I mean, it's only a few percentage points, but that is pretty substantial in the grand scheme of things. And this is especially true for variable rate mortgages, right? So typically monthly payments are fixed for 5 years, which is when the mortgage contract comes up for renewal, or if a certain trigger rate is hit. And the trigger rate can be dependent on, what the loan to value, or if the principal balance in the mortgages balloons up to a high enough amount because, the interest rate's gone up so high that now people's fixed monthly payments aren't even covering all the interest. So interest is being added to the principal, which can cause the principal to increase. If it increases to a certain point, then there's a trigger rate that can be hit there, which is when they're forced to increase their monthly payments, even if the mortgage isn't up for renewal just yet. So in the coming years, really, is really where you're going to see the true effect of these rate hikes take place, which is kind of why the forecast is set to increase throughout 2023 here. So that's really the disadvantage of variable rate mortgages. And what was also interesting is to see how popular variable interest rate mortgages became as a result of, the lower interest rates that we saw before, which I think makes sense. I mean, when interest rates were low kind of in, 2020, 2021, maybe more so in 2020, this was before we had the whole inflation problem. And really for a decade before that, you had interest rates being extremely low. So a variable interest rate mortgage made sense at that time because people weren't expecting, this inflation problem to happen, and then ultimately the mortgage payments to get extremely high. So we can see this chart here that the popularity in 2021 really increased quite a bit. So this is a major reason why you're seeing the debt servicing costs go up. And this is really just one way that interest rates, and which interest rates are the main tool of the central bank, how it's designed to slow down economic activity, right? Because if a higher percentage of people's disposable income is going towards debt service, which is something that they can't really get out of, um, then that's going to reduce the amount of money that they have to spend on other areas, which ultimately slows down economic activity, right? So that's just one way. It also relates to businesses. Businesses can't really reinvest back in themselves as heavily, which that also decreases, the amount of economic activity overall, and consumers start spending less money. And, just overall, when rates are higher, the economy slows down. So that's really the goal of the central bank here. So let's go back to the meeting minutes that was published by the Bank of Canada. Now, keep in mind the mandate of any central bank is to keep inflation at the target rate, which for Canada is 2%. And they do that by using the tools available to them, which is mainly quantitative easing and changes to interest rates. So here are the minutes from the actual meeting that took place in late January. There was another meeting that just happened a few days ago, but the summary for that one isn't published just yet. And in here, they point to a few key data points that they consider as leading indicators of what inflation should look like in the coming months. And one thing I want to highlight is what they're saying here, which is that the full impact should be felt in the quarters to come. So the full impact isn't felt just yet. They're expecting to take place, kind of in the next couple months. Now, where will we actually see this impact? Well, there's a few key data points we can look at, one of which is in jobs. So this is the labor force survey for January of 2023. And in January, Canada added 150,000 jobs, which was well above expectations. And if we look at the meeting minutes from the Bank of Canada, they described this as a symptom of an economy still in excess demand, which essentially just means they see this as a inflationary indicator. So why would something like this be considered inflationary? Well, more jobs means more income for consumers, which means more spending, which means inflation is less likely to come down, which means it's possible more interest rates are coming in the future. But this is just one key data point. You never analyze an entire economy by looking at just one key data point. So let's look at one other one, which is this one here, which is retail sales. So this also kind of shows us what consumer demand is like, because if the Bank of Canada is raising rates, but people are still spending a lot of money, then inflation just won't go down. So there was an increase in retail sales here in December of 2022, 0.5% month over month, which may not sound like much, but when we look at what we've been seeing, throughout the past few months, which we can get a more holistic view looking at this chart here. So I'll change this and we'll go back to say February of 2022. We can look at what they've trended as throughout. And keep in mind that the Bank of Canada started their rate hikes at the beginning of 2022, and we can see that they increased throughout the year. So it was 60 billion here in February of 2022, and it increased all the way to 62 billion in December of 2022. So that doesn't really look like an economy that is slowing down, right? That's what economists and the Bank of Canada is interpreting as inflationary. So if we do see this trend continue, that's another indicator the Bank of Canada is going to look at. If they don't see that number start to come down or at least moderate a little bit, then that is going to influence their interest rate decision. Now, another key data point that they're monitoring, and this is probably the most obvious one, and that is energy prices. So this would directly link to inflation because, for one, it's a part of inflation, but also it indirectly links to inflation through its influence on things like transportation, food, things like that. And you may be looking at this and thinking, well, this doesn't really make sense. I mean, the price of energy is determined globally, right? It's a global commodity and the price is determined by global economic actors. Why is the interest rate on my mortgage on a house in Canada related in some way to what energy prices are, which can change very suddenly depending on what OPEC decides to do, or maybe if there's a war that breaks out? Energy costs, as we can see in this chart here, they fluctuate quite a lot and they're very unpredictable. But to that, I would say you also have to consider that countries around the world, their central banks are increasing their interest rates. And what this means is increasing interest rates, it induces people to save as opposed to spend their money, which trickles into less spending on energy, so reduced demand overall, thus reduced energy prices, thus lower inflation, and thus central banks respond to that with, not increasing interest rates further. And we can see, this website here, which shows us the direction of interest rate changes throughout all the central banks around the world. And we can look at this here, which shows us, just the general direction they're heading in. Generally, central banks are increasing rates. We can see a lot of red arrows pointing up. There are a few exceptions, particularly in Asian economies. We can see the Bank of China, I guess, their key interest rate is on the way down. The Indonesian one is on the way down. The Japanese one is on the way down. So there are a few that are actually decreasing their interest rates. But as we can see, by and large, central banks around the world are increasing their interest rates. So if we look at what inflation has actually been in Canada, so the CPI, we can see in January of 2023 it rose 5.9% year over year, which was following a 6.3% increase in December. So it is showing some signs of decelerating. And core inflation rose by 4.9% year over year. So core inflation, stripping out the impacts of food and energy. So for those of you that don't eat food or consume energy, I guess that figure would be relevant to you. But what I want to actually do here is show, what the trend in inflation has been like pretty much throughout the past year, because I think it's going to reveal some interesting insights. Rather than just looking at the one headline number, if we look at what the data actually consists of, it can tell us some things. So most of the inflation that has occurred year over year occurred in the earlier parts of the year. So this is, what the actual CPI is, this all items number here. In February of 2022, it was 146.8, and then increased to 153.1 in July, which versus January is only 0.8 higher. So most of the inflation actually occurred in the earlier part of the year. So pretty much for from August 2022 or July 2022 through to December of 2022, there wasn't actually any inflation. And then if we look at energy costs, which again, this is going to be a big part of it, most of the inflation, or a big chunk of the inflation, was driven by energy costs, which again was allocated in the earlier parts of the year. We can see the number for energy, 199 in February of 2022. It went all the way up to 242.5 in June of 2022, but it's actually come down quite a bit, all the way to 200 in January of 2023. So we can see one of the key reasons why inflation is leveling off is because of energy costs going down. So really what you can interpret from that is, if you want to know what the Bank of Canada is looking at in regards to how they're going to change their interest rates, energy costs is a big part of that, because that certainly drives inflation. So anyways, guys, I hope you did find this video insightful into how the Bank of Canada decides what interest rates are going to be, and also just to help you learn about general economic conditions in this country. What I showed in this video was really just a couple examples of some data that they look at. There are plenty of other examples out there. They really take a holistic view in deciding what to do with regards to interest rates. But if you did enjoy this video, then please leave a like. And if you're new to my channel, I'd appreciate if you would consider subscribing. And I'll see you guys in the next video.